I'm gonna talk through a few things that I've noticed, just things that I've seen and read on social media and stuff like that about coronavirus and public transport. It's not going to be at all comprehensive or as much detail as I would like, but that would take hours. And also, I want to say I'm not making any predictions about where I think some of the changes that we've seen will go or how long that they'll last, because we can go down rabbit holes with that stuff. So the main things to say are, obviously we've got a huge focus on public safety in lots of different ways that I'm going to pick through. We've got huge government intervention, but I think the type of intervention that we've seen is important. Let me just check in the chat. No, that's fine. The type of intervention that governments are doing is important for us to focus on. Essential journeys, so like who and what kind of journeys count as essential, and how is that making us think differently about transport more broadly, and then loads of different ways of improving the commutes for key workers in Scotland and around the world. And there's hundreds, but I'll run through some of them. Okay. So the first and maybe most obvious point to make is that public transport is a risk, right? Public transport is a site of possible infection. The few people who are out and about need to be very careful when they use it. And so for those of us, many of us in this call who've been campaigning for public transport, because it's important to air pollution, to greenhouse gas emission reduction, social isolation, physical activity, all of these things, seeing public transport kind of have this risk attached to it is kind of heartbreaking, but also more importantly and more immediately, it's a risk for public transport workers. And that, so just to say, by the way, at 8 p.m, there'll be a clap. I don't know if you know, like every Thursday at 8 p.m, I think there's clap. Initially it was NHS workers, and then I think last week it was care workers. But the TUC were tweeting earlier about how this 8 p.m. it will be all key workers, which for me needs to, like, we need to remember the risk that public transport workers are taking whenever they go to work, just to keep the system running. Right, okay, so we've had a huge reduction in the number of journeys we take. This news story is actually from more than a week ago, so it'll be way more than that now. Sorry, the other thing I should have said is that this presentation will be online, it'll be on YouTube, and all of the links, all of these web pages that I'm showing, that will be in the notes to the video. So anything that I show that you're interested to find out more about, that will be on Friends of the Earth Scotland's YouTube page. Right, so we've had this huge reduction in journeys. Most of us aren't going anywhere except our home. So this is a competition on a website called City Lab, which is really good, which is inviting people to draw their experience of lockdown. And this drawing makes a lot of sense to me, that many of us are staying pretty close to our homes. We're walking, and so we're just accessing the places immediately around about us. So we're maybe discovering or relying on local shops that we might not have used as much in other times, and local green spaces in particular. And so it's kind of the lockdown and the pandemic more generally is maybe reshaping how we're thinking about ourselves and the space around us. And one of the main things we found out is it's difficult to stay 2 meters apart from people, right? This is someone on Twitter talking about the amount of public space and how little there actually is for pedestrians. So if a pavement's 1.5 meters and we're supposed to stay 2 meters away from everyone to safely socially distance, you can't pass someone on the pavement. One of you has to go on the road, right? So the pedestrian space is insufficient. That's a kind of main road in Manchester. This is a more residential space. a residential street, sorry, but the same ratio applies of a huge amount of space for cars, right, road space, and then a tiny pavement. I've removed a word from Hannah's tweet so that this webinar can stay family friendly, but you can use your imagination. But Hannah's basically making the point that roads take up so much space. Right, and so for those of us who worked through the Transport Bill or the Transport Act as it became, we're a little bit familiar with this tension, because there was a lot of debate around pavement parking and double parking, which is particularly harmful for wheelchair users or people pushing prams or buggies, people who need maybe a bit more space on the pavement. A car parking up on the pavement can really hinder you. You can't get past, and then you've either got a choice of going onto the road or taking an alternate route. Okay, so this is the relevant part of the legislation, that pavement parking prohibition doesn't exist. It's exempt if the vehicle gives you 1.5 meters. In other words, it wouldn't allow you to safely socially distance. And then this other bit below that, where it also doesn't count if the vehicle's been there for less than 20 minutes to allow people to make deliveries. So this law is kind of nonsense and is in practice unenforceable anyway. Right. Right. Now, I'll leave that. Okay, so a lot of you know we've had a huge reduction in air pollution. This is a graph of the nitrogen dioxide, so it's diesel pollution on Hope Street in Glasgow. And you can see that over the last couple of weeks, it's dropped significantly. But still a couple of spikes, right? So it's not gone away completely. And I think that's because, so a lot of our buses are still running, which we'll come on to. And a lot of the buses in Glasgow and across Scotland, older, big diesel vehicles. So those spikes could just be 2 or 3 buses waiting at traffic lights, right? So it wouldn't take that much if it's a big vehicle that's polluting, which I'll talk. All right, so we know that there's quickly emerging evidence about the links between COVID-19 and air pollution. These underlying conditions that we're hearing so much about that maybe affect our hearts and our lungs, those are things that can be caused or exacerbated, many of them by air pollution. So this is a new paper that found a correlation with an increase in PM 2.5, which is tiny particles, right? It comes from transport, it can come from other stuff. But if you increase the amount of PM 2.5, then the death rate of COVID-19 increases. But just to say, that paper's not been published yet. This is about the clamour for evidence around COVID-19, that sometimes some evidence makes it into the press when it hasn't been peer reviewed. Right, this is another monitoring station, Blantyre, which I picked because I knew there was quite a few supermarkets round about it. And you can see that for the PM, which is the sort of upper level, there hasn't even been that much of a reduction in the particulates. So that could be a few things. It could be nothing, it could be an aberration, but it could also be the deliveries to supermarkets and to pharmacies and things like that. Because our supermarkets have got unprecedented kind of week before Christmas level of demand, we would expect to see a lot more HGVs on the road. So any roads where they've got a lot of supermarkets and maybe a lot of the bus network is still active, we might not find that much air pollution reduction. And also, like, we're all inside our house anyway, so what good is the cleaner air if we can't enjoy it? Yeah, right. So one of the main things that this crisis in terms of transport has pulled out for me is the importance of the bus network and keeping that running for key workers, but also the risk that public transport workers face. So this is an article this is just about London, that 9 people who work on the buses, 14 public transport workers altogether have died from coronavirus. So public transport workers are at significant risk. And that's why the clap at 8 p.m., whatever you think about that, I do think in whatever way you choose that you think is appropriate, it's important to recognise the risks that public transport workers are taking just to transport our other key workers. Right, so bus passenger ship has disappeared, and bus companies have this massive shortfall. So the Scottish government, this is ages ago, that's why I've circled that. That's like, that might have even been before lockdown, or, you know, it was quite a while ago anyway. A lot of the people who take buses in Scotland use the concessionary fare travel scheme. This is people over 65, some people with disabilities, other groups. Whenever they get the bus, they don't pay, and the Scottish government pays that bus operator a portion of what that fare would have cost. Now, no one's getting the bus, but the government said, no worries, we'll pay what we forecasted to pay you anyway. So basically, they'll probably pay them the same amount as last year. So the Scottish government's paying a huge amount, really, to bus operators for a small number of passengers, because I guess they recognise how important it is for those passengers, right? If you work in a hospital and you get the bus to work, that's going to be really bad if that bus stops running. So it's recognising the huge importance of keeping our bus network running, but at the same time, the government is paying a huge amount of money for no control, right? It's just keeping the service running. So Get Glasgow Moving, who a lot of you will know as public transport campaign, have this campaign for buyout, not bailout, right? So that's about, don't just bail out companies, but buy them out, take them into public ownership, take the bus network into public ownership. And I want to talk just a bit about the difference between those two things. So there's a campaign, this is more of a global campaign about aviation bailouts. It's telling respective domestic governments, if you give a bailout to airline companies, make sure that there's conditions, right? Make sure that they're treating their workers better, and make sure they're preparing for huge carbon emission reductions, which are essential. Just a handout, a bailout, if you like, with no conditions attached, is particularly, I think, for the aviation industry, would be a disaster. Right, so in rail, that's a picture of Grant Shapps. Just thought it would be nice to have a profile picture in there. Chose him. He's the Transport Minister for the UK government, and he announced the rail emergency measures, right? So this is for trains, and this is similar. This is his speech in the Commons, I think. He said, this is just about stopping the rail operators going into insolvency. So it's about keeping companies afloat, even if they might not even really be running that much, not that many passengers. It's just about keeping them afloat, and so then after the lockdown, or even after the whole pandemic, they'll be around to function again as train companies. But he's keen to stress it's temporary and it's not intrusive, it's just about money. Okay, and so this is important to me, that's a bailout, not a buyout. Right, so this is a picture from RBS campaigning, right, Friends of the Earth. So the bailouts in the 2008 global financial crisis, which was a hugely different time, lots of things were different about it. I don't want to draw too many parallels, but it was a time where there was an unprecedented contribution from government to save ostensibly private companies, right? And so I think there's some things that we could potentially learn from that or think about from that. The government bailed out RBS, so a huge amount of money, a publicly owned bank, but then the bank was doing loads of stuff that we didn't like or wasn't helping people. This is a really convoluted action, which was to highlight that RBS was investing and profiting quite a lot from mountaintop removal. So this is a publicly owned bank which is doing loads of stuff that we don't like, but we didn't have really any mechanism of stopping them doing it. because very few conditions were added in the initial bailout, right, back in the sort of heat of the financial crash, when it seemed like the banks would go to the wall and the governments needed to keep cash machines working. And I think that's something that we really need to monitor and think about. What's the future of our transport system? What do we want it to look like? And what might be happening now that might have long-term consequences, or might not have long-term consequences, but that we would want. And as far as I can see, so far there's not that many conditions, certainly in Scotland and UK context. In other countries, we might find different. And then this idea about essential. So in my campaigning work to try and talk about car use reduction measures, people will often say, a politician might say, yeah, but people need those cars. We need 3 million fossil fuel cars in Scotland because people need to make those journeys. Now, that's certainly true, but also what this lockdown shows us is that an essential journey or a necessary journey is context dependent and shifts a lot depending on what's happening. And I think we've all had to think a lot about the way that we're traveling, where are we traveling to, when, how, and how can we ensure that we reduce the risk to ourselves and to everyone around us. I think that might have some long-term consequences for how we think about transport. Maybe not, you know, maybe it's too early to say. Right, finally, I just want to go through loads of ways of improving commutes for key workers. So there's lots of different things to talk about here. There's been free bike share schemes, or bike share that you used to have to pay for. Now they've made them free bus travel, emergency bike lanes, which I'll talk about. A lot of removal or reduction in parking charges, emission restrictions, things like that. The ultra low emission zone in London is suspended. Low emission zones in Scotland and clean air zones in England, I expect that a lot of them will be postponed, suspended, potentially even watered down, with under the explanation of trying to make it easier for key workers to get around. Okay, so that was one of the earliest ones, right? 24th of March, that feels like a lifetime ago now, that in Scotland it was announced that hospital parking charges were suspended. That was a huge kind of political hot potato, because a lot of hospital car parks are kind of privately owned or public-private partnership nonsense, so it was deemed as quite difficult. But obviously loads of people who work in hospitals don't want to have to pay for parking every day. And then just as soon as the pandemic started to get quite acute, that happened overnight, right? Something that's been in the background for ages. Toll roads have been suspended. Nextbike in Glasgow is free now. It was free for all NHS staff for like a week or 2 weeks. They trialed it, and now it's free for all key workers. Right, in Wales, they've made bus travel free for NHS staff, which is something that Friends of the Earth Scotland has started speaking about, should be brought in Scotland. So far, all we've seen is individual efforts. So this is Explore in Dundee. So an individual operator making this offer to NHS staff. So that would be mainly, if you know Dundee, in Nine Wells Hospital, which is absolutely enormous and is quite a bit outside of the city. So I would imagine hopefully a lot of NHS staff can take advantage of that offer to travel to Nine Wells every day. And this apparently tiny but maybe significant announcement from yesterday. So Stagecoach and McGill's have done this partnership where if you buy a ticket on one bus, you can use it on the other operator's service. Sounds totally minor, in a lot of other countries would be standard practice. We've like never had this. Integrated ticketing has proved really difficult to get governments to get their heads around it, to get all the different operators to work together, has been really difficult. But this tiny measure for integrated ticketing, just on a couple of services, could be a model for long term where we could encourage all operators to be able to integrate their services, so you only need to buy one ticket, because it's kind of absurd that you need to buy more than that. Right, so these are some measures for unlocking more public space and kind of addressing those tensions I talked about earlier, where our pavements don't allow us to safely socially distance. This is in a huge kind of national park in Vancouver that has a lot of roads through it, but obviously a lot of people are going there to get their exercise and need to be distant from one another, so they've stopped car travel through the park so it brings the road space into play as a pedestrian space. This is in Berlin, where they've, if you can see on that picture on the left, they've doubled the width of the cycle lanes, and they've just put down a bit of paint and some cones, right? So very informal, very ad hoc. But this means that people can cycle to their work, or people who are cycling for leisure, and make sure that they're safely far enough apart from one another, right? They're keeping themselves safe and keeping other people safe. Similar thing in New York as well. Also, Bogota, which already had massive amounts of cycling. And these are measures that I've started speaking to councils and Scottish Government that we should be bringing in here, because they're low cost, relatively easy to introduce, and will increase people's safety and ability to get to work safely. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it there. And just to say, those are some of the things I'm interested in starting to monitor or potentially even campaign on. Or we could even talk about what does campaigning look like when we're all in lockdown. But if you're interested in sort of being a part of that, or just want to discuss it some more, you can email me. My email address is there, or you can send me your email address in the chat, like message me directly. Just message me your email address and I'll make sure you're looped in. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now.